I heard some very wise YouTubers recently say, in regard to the newest Venom movie, that you can like crap as long as you acknowledge it's crap. And I love this saying. It's the same thing I say to those who defend the Rings of Power. But there are many who will ask, who determines whether a piece of art is crap to begin with? How do we judge it? How do we define it? It's a question that many of us might be quick to dismiss as an avoidance tactic by those who don't want to admit they love crap, but I believe it's a question very worth asking. Let's go back to the age-old question. Can art be objectively judged as good or bad? Or is it entirely subjective? I used to say, yes, we can judge art objectively, mainly because to say it's all subjective often feels like a lazy way to shut down a debate with someone who disagrees with you to avoid having to admit you might be right. However, the deeper I've gotten into the world of criticism and storytelling over the years, the more thought I've had to put into this question, because it's not as simple as it might appear. And I have found myself wondering, what metric do I even use to determine something's quality? A video I watched not too long ago by the channel Just Right covered this topic, and while I have my own stance that somewhat differs from his, he pointed out that seeing art in such black and white terms as we're prone to do not only stifles conversation just as much as denying the existence of measurable quality altogether by reducing critical rhetoric into a two-sided shouting match, but it also kind of takes away everything that makes art beautiful. So with time, my views have matured, and I've come to realize that beauty is in the eye of the beholder, and everyone is entitled to their tastes and opinions. However, I can't help but feel not only that we can measure quality in art such as film, but we really should. It's just not as simple as we like to make it. So here, I hope to lay out my own thoughts on how I try to measure quality and judge the artistry in my entertainment, and I hope that maybe it can help you to look at your entertainment more critically, while possibly fostering more nuanced conversation about it. But if you're new to the channel, I'm just thinking out loud here, so if you like my brain vomit, you know where the like and subscribe buttons are. Now without further ado, let's dive into it. Just Right's video brought up a book written by Immanuel Kant in 1790, titled The Critique of Judgement, in which Kant discussed how we perceive reality, including what makes art so unique. He breaks things down into 4 categories into which we can put things we consider good based on what makes them good. These categories are called the beautiful, the good, the agreeable, which I'm going to be referring to as the satisfying, and the sublime. I found these categories a fascinating way to break down what we mean when we define something as good in any form of art, so I'm going to frame my argument around these basic categories, though I will be adapting them to my own perspective and uses. The purpose of my video isn't to break down Kant's philosophy, so I don't claim that everything I say here will necessarily represent his thinking. In fact, I just wanted to use the ideas presented in his book as inspiration and make my own model for judging art, but eventually I ended up coming back to his ideas in my final script because they really are pretty good. So let's go through his 4 categories and explain them, as I have adapted them to apply particularly to judging art, specifically fiction. What Kant defines as beautiful is the most subjective of his categories, and comes down entirely to personal taste. Obviously, our own taste is the biggest factor in our minds when we judge art. Individual preference supersedes all in our own judgment, but I think, while there is subjectivity to the other categories, taste should be kept separate from discussions of quality, as the other categories provide much more measurable metrics we can agree upon. Beauty, or should we say pleasure, however, is not something we can discuss or argue about. It's entirely in the eye of the beholder. For instance, many people love gory horror films, and I am not one of them, but while my bias against them may make me judge them harshly, I will always acknowledge that my distaste for them doesn't make them bad for what they are. Those who say all art is entirely subjective tend to think this is the only metric for measuring it. But as you can tell, we're just getting started here. So for the rest of this video, let's put personal taste, or beauty as Kant puts it, aside to see what makes art we may or may not like, good or bad, for what it's meant to be. What Kant describes as the good is that which fills its intended purpose, and that makes it somewhat relative, yet, in my opinion, still objective. There are qualities that make a sword objectively good or bad for chopping and stabbing and wielding effectively, but those are different from the qualities that make a hammer good or bad at whacking and smashing stuff. Now, many people think this metric can't be applied to art because art doesn't have a defined purpose. Art can be whatever it wants to be, or even whatever the audience wants it to be. And that is true, sort of. So I want to break this category down a bit further to see how we can apply it to art. Obviously, this is an extremely complicated factor, as a medium like film involves countless different skill sets to pull together, and should be measured based on all of those individually. However, it gets even more complicated than that, as even just looking at writing alone, there are countless skills a writer can employ, such as logical consistency, deep character development, engaging dialogue, creating suspense, conveying emotion, and on and on. No writer possesses, or chooses to employ, every skill they could, all the time. So we must judge each skill individually. But how many skill metrics should we judge something on? Should we judge a comedy like Spaceballs for not being thematically deep or suspenseful? Well, no, because it's not meant to be. Which leads to my next part of this metric. When judging a piece of entertainment, ask yourself, how does it accomplish what it is trying to accomplish? A dumb slapstick comedy shouldn't be judged for its lack of depth or nuance any more than a dark and reflective character study should be judged for its lack of snappy dialogue or clever gags. Different results require different skill sets, so judge it based on how well it used or balanced the skill sets needed to pull off its objective. Of course, the more things a piece of entertainment is able to effectively pull off simultaneously, the better. Art is also bound to try to be what it claims to be. Even if a show like Rings of Power was good on its own merits, if it claims to be a faithful adaptation of Tolkien's work made for his fans, then it should be compared to the works it relies upon for its limited viewership, which is a perfect segue into Kant's third category. This is what Kant called the agreeable, and it essentially describes that which satisfies a desire or need. I almost didn't include this in my own system because to me it seemed like nearly the same thing as personal taste, at least as far as it applied to art, but I realized there was something else I hadn't considered that should be factored into objective judgment, and I think this category in Kant's system describes it well. This realization came when I thought of Joker, Folie à Deux. This is an interesting case study because it is a film that took a lot of talent to make in terms of acting, directing, cinematography, and so on. And I'd say Todd Phillips made exactly the movie he wanted to. So, by my last metric, it should be considered good, right? Well, it turns out the internet is pretty unanimous that this is a very bad movie, so why is that? I understand the reasons, but how did they fit into my metrics? I thought maybe it was just taste, but that didn't seem right, because everyone seems to agree about it. People have pointed out reasons the film isn't enjoyable that do come down to writing, such as the story being simply boring and unsatisfying in its resolution, so perhaps there are some skill issues, but like I said, I think the director did exactly what he wanted. And even if the movie were more enjoyable, I think people would still have been angry about what it does with the character and how it builds upon, or rather, tears down, the original. So I'm not sure the real issue is one of quality. Thus, after trying to make this system my own, I just ended up realizing Kant was right all along. So how does Joker 2 fail at being agreeable or satisfying? Well, the audience went in with some basic expectations. That is, as a sequel, it would build upon what the original movie did rather than undo it, and as a movie supposedly based on a comic book character, that it would actually explore that character rather than reveal the protagonist was never that character to begin with. Art tends to present itself as something and make certain implicit promises to its audience. In fact, its audience is determined by what it presents itself as and what kind of experience it promises to be. So when the product fails to meet those expectations it set for itself, it leaves the audience unsatisfied, frustrated, and even angry when the creator's choices feel deliberate and spiteful. And this is what makes Joker 2 bad. Now, this leads into the topic of subverting expectations, which I'm not going to talk about much here, but I don't think subverting expectations is inherently bad, as long as you know what you're doing and are careful to pleasantly surprise rather than disappoint the audience. Give them more than what they ask for, not less. How to do that, however, is the topic of another video. Finally, we have the Sublime. This refers to the depth, the thematic, and subtextual content that makes the art resonate. This is a tough category to consider, and many critics now don't seem to think this contributes to something's quality. But I personally tend to measure art primarily by how well it sticks with me, and how deeply it resonates with me. In other words, the depth of what it has to say, and how effectively it says it. Now, I understand those who say that not all stories need to be deep, and I'm not saying stories with no depth are necessarily bad because of it. For example, Deadpool and Wolverine has absolutely no depth or meaning or emotional resonance whatsoever. Is that its fault? Should it be labeled as bad because of it? Well, by my own metrics, no, because it had no intention to be. It does everything it intends to as pure fan service, so for what it's trying to be, it's essentially perfect. However, I personally find that there is a profound difference between the amusement park rides of movies whose only meaning derives from their appeal to the audience's familiarity with modern pop culture and Marvel fans' nostalgia for the last 25 years of superhero films, and thus provide a fun experience but will fade rapidly with time, and stories that are timeless because of their powerful themes that resonate through generations. Stories like Shakespeare's that have been preserved and retold for centuries because of their profound messages and characters. And I believe that though there's nothing wrong with the existence of the former, the latter are so much more worthy of praise, and are thus, within this important category, better. Here's my thing. I think we're doing a disservice to art by boiling down all the nuanced conversation there is to be had into two categories, good and bad. Let's instead use many more descriptive adjectives to describe what we think makes them good or bad according to our metrics. Are they profound or dumb? Are they fun or boring? What makes them fun and what makes them profound? What skill was put into them? What do they have to say and how do they say it? Ultimately, I respect everyone's right to enjoy what they like, but I'd like to invite you to look a bit more closely and critically at the art you enjoy, and hesitate to call it good simply because you like it, or bad simply because you don't. For example, I didn't enjoy Oppenheimer as much as I wanted to when I first saw it, because it was so dense and confusing that it was hard to get into and fully appreciate on a first watch. And it didn't give me everything I'd expected or wanted from it. But is it well crafted on just about every front? Of course. Is it profound in its messages and exploration of an individual life? Absolutely. And are the reasons I didn't instantly love it worth looking at? Yes, even if they don't detract from it, because they're worth learning from for those who wish to avoid those choices. However, I don't know that I can judge Christopher Nolan for making them, because I think he made exactly the movie he wanted to. Does that negate those things that will make it less enjoyable for many viewers? Not for everyone, but that ultimately comes down to taste. Nolan could have made a more digestible film that might have been appreciated by a wider audience, but he didn't want to. And if he had, those who do appreciate it as it is wouldn't have loved it nearly as much as they do. You see the kind of conversation we can have if we look at things more deeply than we might allow ourselves to, if we instantly put art in black and white categories based on our initial reaction? Instead of arguing whether Oppenheimer was good because of the deeply intricate and meticulous approach to the narrative, or bad because it hit the ground running without grounding the audience in a point in time, we can acknowledge both realities and appreciate its quality, while deciding if it works for us and applying the lessons we learn to our own storytelling, whether that means emulating or avoiding Nolan's choices. So I hope that helps. This video was fun to make, so thanks for watching to the end. It has been on my list for a while, but until recently the topic just seemed too big and too complicated to tackle. Please let me know your thoughts on my metrics in the comments and share how you go about judging art yourself. I look forward to continuing the conversation with you there. Until next time, never stay silent.